Biden being far left, Biden not really caring about the country and really just wanting to take your hard-earned money, when those things just simply aren't true. They're just things that have been co-opted by the conservative right to spark fear into voters and to ensure that voters continue to support Trump despite his history of not really caring about this country, as shown by the pandemic, and also this history of fascism and this history of racism as well.
Okay, yeah, those are all really, really great points. Talking about like why certain states stayed red and the kind of rhetoric that was being disseminated by the conservative right that encouraged like rural communities in Iowa and in Ohio to stay conservative and vote red. There actually was, just talking about voting populations and who is allowed to vote. I know there were cases in Florida specifically where a referendum was passed to allow ex-felons to vote, and that would have increased the voting population. But that was kind of struck down by the state government as well. And when we're talking about the populations that are allowed to vote and the populations that could have a major impact in turning states blue, the like ex-felon population is a major voting pool that just is taken away from Democrats whenever they are disenfranchised. But also on that point of like ex-felon disenfranchisement, we have California. So moving into more state roles, state amendments and state changes to the state constitution that have been passed. California passed Prop 17, which allows ex-felons to vote on parole. So as soon as they actually leave prison, they can vote, which is a major win to giving like suffrage back to ex-felons at a more expedited rate. And again, changing those voting pools. So it's a really dynamic situation on like who is allowed to vote and how that affects outcomes in elections. And honestly, like the movements that come out this summer that have intensified in the past summer are also associated with those voting pools. And just one of the other questions that I kind of wanted to ask you in this regard is like, we know what's happened with the election, but what does this mean for ongoing movements? What does a Democratic president like Joe Biden mean for Black Lives Matter, for example, and other ongoing movements?
Yeah, I think what this really means moving forward is that it allows social movements to continue building and continue growing. You know, like I said before, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not the ideal candidates that we wanted at all. You know, they still support the police and prison system. However, having a Democratic president still allows us to do the necessary work and to continue to push back without having to face as many barriers as we faced during the Trump administration. And also just having someone in office who at least recognizes that racism is wrong, recognizes that, you know, there is a problem in our police system, and recognizes that racism is still very much alive in America, and we can't continue to ignore it, and we can't continue to perpetuate it in the ways that the Trump administration and Trump supporters have also done that. But it's important to keep in mind that for everyone, that voting is only step one. There's still so much more that people can and need to do in order for us to see the change that we want to see.
Right, definitely. There is still so much left to push back against, both institutionally and on the ground in electoral politics. The work is definitely not finished, not even close, I would say. But these are all issues that we will continue to talk about with our wonderful guest speaker in the Brown Breakdown. It's the Brown Breakdown.
Liliana Zaragoza serves as Assistant Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She has worked on several different cases pertaining to voting rights, school desegregation cases, and civil criminal justice matters. Prior to joining LDF, she was a Skadden Fellow and State Attorney at the New York Legal Assistant Group, where she represented domestic workers in federal and state employment cases. She has also served as a law clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Ms. Zaragoza received her JD from Columbia Law School, where she was the first Latina editor-in-chief of the Columbia Law Review, and is a graduate from our very own University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Liliana Zaragoza.
Thank you so much, Liliana, for being with us on this episode of Kind of Sort of Round, where we'll be able to sort of digest and review what has been going on with the election in 2020. Election season has been a very tumultuous time, I think, as we've all experienced. We kind of wanted to dive in and ask how you got into the legal field, specifically in association to voting rights and electoral politics or election law.
Talking
How
about the
did
election
this field
and there's
draw you
plenty
in,
to talk about there when it comes to voting rights and on the other end voter suppression or restrictions on the right to vote. I came to this work entirely through racial justice and from that lens. And initially when I was in college and even before then, right, I came to the issues of racial justice based on my own experience, right? Like any person of color. And for me, a non-Black person of color, I knew based on my experience growing up in Arizona, and, I was the daughter of a single mother from Mexico, I knew what we experienced, right? And the challenges that we experienced. And my mom, wasn't a citizen until 2001, thankfully, before 9/11. So really lucked out on the timing there. Arizona came up in the election a lot this year. And so those things will segue. But, we were ostracized. There was rampant xenophobia, race and racism, right, was just everywhere. I mean, it is obviously pervasive racism in the United States. It's what the United States was founded on. But I really started to understand how you can use the law to really fight for people of color. And now I fight for Black people using the law. But I really came to learn more about that when I was in college. I finally kind of got to learn the things that I was deprived of learning through my public school education. My mom was an immigrant. She wasn't there to teach me a lot, right, about U.S. history and its intersection with race and racism. It was through taking human rights courses and courses on mass incarceration that started to get an actual, a more accurate picture of what the United States is actually about, basically. I spoke with a professor who's still there at UChicago, Susan Zesch, who was an immigration lawyer. I took one of her human rights courses and I just asked, what kind of work should I be doing? I really wanted to get involved in the work of racial justice. And at that time, specifically through the lens of immigrants' rights, because it was what I really understood. I went to go be an organizer with the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, which is now Alianza Americas, and also the National Immigrant Justice Center. I really started to see that you could really do concrete things for oppressed peoples with the law. Once I actually went to law school is when everything kind of changed and how I ended up where I am now. I went to law school thinking I wanted to be an immigration lawyer. I did do some immigration law related work as a law student, representing people in removal proceedings. But when I took constitutional law, right, when I actually started to think about, everything that relates to immigration, I just kept coming back to race. Right? Everything about the United States and immigration and the way that we've controlled, who gets access to citizenship, right? I am a beneficiary of birthright citizenship, and that was only possible because of the Reconstruction Amendments. Deciding who gets to be a citizen or not, who gets to come here or not, who gets what rights or not. And it really all comes back to race. And it also comes back to the struggle for the rights of Black people in the United States. That became what the goal was, right? Undo racial injustice and racial oppression. I mean, LDF is, one of the oldest organizations, if not the oldest civil rights organization doing this work, and specifically for Black people. So that was the right place to go. And once you're there, you realize, LDF now works predominantly in 4 different areas of the law: criminal justice, political participation, economic justice, and education. And I work on a little bit of everything, right? Because everything truly intersects. Like, it's funny that you ask how I got interested in the work of voting rights work. I never thought that I would be doing this work. My experience before going there was actually mostly in immigration law and in employment law. I represented domestic workers for a couple of years. Working on racial justice issues broadly was the goal. And so it's actually interesting how much I've come to understand voting rights from what feels like a little bit of a voting rights outsider's perspective, but I've come to really understand how critical it is, like critical of a piece it is to all of the other forms of racial justice.
Right, yeah. It's so interesting that just like hearing your backstory and how this new exposure to a different kind of education that you weren't familiar with originally inspired you to look more critically at the racially divided country that we live in and how you can mobilize your own skills to combat that.
Yeah,
and then how you wanted to go into immigration law and how that is inextricably tied to race.
Education once you came to college, about U.S. race relations, how race functions in America, and I feel like that's extremely, extremely important to touch on, because when we take these classes on race, on racism, on critical race theory, it opens our eyes to how race has been formed in this country and how it's sort of been used systematically to oppress people. And I think that that's something that we're not taught, obviously, in elementary school, middle school, and high school when talking about the U.S. history. And I think that is incredibly important, because it's that kind of knowledge and that kind of work that liberates us from this idea that America has been a perfect country, but it also liberates us in that it allows us to know that there's still much work to be done in this country. Hopefully inspires us to do that kind of work, as it's inspired you, as it's inspired me. Our next question for you is really in regards to the records of Joe Biden and Donald Trump when it comes to racial justice and what their separate impacts on Black, Brown, and other communities of color, as well as marginalized communities, have been, given the events from this summer, given the even recent events now in terms of different forms of voter suppression, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yeah, what have been their separate records, at least as far as you know? What is the quality and likelihood of their separate promises that have been made to POC coming into fruition?
As an initial kind of step zero response, right? One of the key premises that we have to acknowledge is that the first, several presidents were enslavers, right? The first several presidents were enslavers. There are presidents like FDR, right, who committed Japanese internment, right, or rather Japanese internment occurred under that administration. Some of the greatest civil rights statutes occurred under LBJ, but he thought that a lot of civil rights leaders were a thorn in his side, basically. People who were seeking racial justice, right, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were under surveillance, right, and COINTELPRO was occurring during that time. And I raise all of this to say that I think regardless of who won, right, in the election, and now we do have a victor, right, even though the current president is still refusing to concede, no radical change was going to happen overnight, right, for the election, regardless of, right, we weren't going to descend into further fascism over one night. It would just continue to happen over 4 years, right? But even if Biden won, and he did, right, the record of the United States is incredibly long and suggests that justice is not necessarily going to happen for Black people or other people of color, queer folks, oppressed people, over the next 4 years, or potentially longer if Biden wins a second term, right? And I think it's fair to say that we have seen the president's record over the last 4 years, and it has been pretty atrocious. The Muslim ban, we have seen the separation of, migrant, and And it's interesting because it is definitely has